we can give thanks to our God. 3 years ago at the Holston Annual Conference at Lake Junaluska in North Carolina in June, the chef for Lake Junaluska quit the day that Holston Conference came. Yeah. And so the nicest way I could put what we had to eat was that the food was abysmal. There was one meal in which I couldn't tell you what the food was, but there were onions in it. And I love onions. And I said to the people seated around the table with me, these are all of the conference folks who work the stage. And so we sit in the back and we eat meals together. And I said to them, I have never met an onion I didn't like. And then they watched my face as I tried to choke down this pearl onion that I don't know what happened to it, but it was inedible. But I had just said I could eat it. And then they laughed harder and harder as I tried to chew, but I couldn't do anything about it because I had said I love those things. So the next year, the Holston conference staff were allowed to bring in food. And it ranged from sandwiches to some Chick-fil-A to the best barbecue I have ever eaten in my whole life. And when we gathered a little later that summer to debrief, I looked at the person who was in charge of getting all of the food, and I said that until that year, I had never been satisfied at conference. I've been able to eat some in some years, but that was the first time that I had ever eaten and felt satisfied. Not just full, but satisfied. I was content. I enjoyed it. The meals brought great taste, but also that satisfaction and contentment. I can't say that we got to keep that. Last year was different. This year I'm better prepared. I will be better prepared in June. But how often can we say that we aren't just full, but that we are satisfied? That the things of life haven't just filled us up, but that we are content today. Wherever Jesus went, crowds gathered. Often they trailed him, they looked for him because he performed miracles. They sought him out because they wanted to see what he could do. And sometimes the crowds got too much, and Jesus would try to get away, but then the people would find him. They kept on coming. And on one particular occasion, the people had been with him for a while, and Jesus decided that they needed to eat some lunch. But the crowd was vast, and they didn't have lunch money. And so Jesus took 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish and divided it, and it was passed amongst the people, and 5,000 were fed. This and the resurrection are the only stories that hit all 4 Gospels, by the way, the story of the feeding of 5,000. And the people ate until their bellies were full. Now, after lunch, Jesus tried to get away again. He had just performed this miracle. Everybody was fed. They should be taking a nap, and he wanted some time by himself. He tried to get away because they had heard about forcing him to become king. And that's not who he was. That's not what he came for. So he wanted to get away. And so he goes up to a mountain alone. And that evening, his disciples go down to the lake, and they get in a boat, and they sail across the water. And eventually, Jesus comes down from the mountain and strolls along the water and makes it to the boat. But then when morning arrives, the crowd who had been with him the day before, who had eaten their fill of fish and bread, well, they're looking for Jesus. And they track him down and question him about when he got to Capernaum. Like, why didn't you tell us you were going there? Or how'd you get there so fast? But Jesus doesn't talk about that. He challenges why they're there. Why had the crowd sought him out? They had pursued him, rowing all the way across the Sea of Galilee because the day before he had given them something to eat. And Jesus says, the only reason you're looking for me is because you're hungry. They'd not come this time because of miracles. They'd come because their bellies were full the day before, and now they're empty the next day, and they are hungry again. Even that miraculous feeding of the 5,000 was outweighed by the fact that their bellies were empty. And so they try to make it better. Say, well, what sign are you going to give us? What miracle are you going to perform now so that we may see and believe you? Now, the day before, they saw and believed because they ate the fish and the loaves of bread. They said, what work are you performing? Remember, our ancestors ate manna in the wilderness. As it is written, God gave them bread from heaven to eat. What are you going to do, Jesus? And then Jesus says, I tell you very truly, it was not Moses who gave the bread from heaven, but it was my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is that which comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. And so they're like, okay, well, give us this kind of bread. Because they're still thinking of bread. And then Jesus says, I am the bread of life, the one who gives life to the world. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. And the people wanted full bellies. They wanted the manna, the bread from heaven that their ancestors had received. They wanted to be full. But being full is never going to satisfy. Just being filled with bread is never going to make you content. And Jesus says, I am the bread that will satisfy. I am the bread of life who gives life to the world and will satisfy every hunger, every longing. I am the one that you need every day. Not just something to fill your stomachs, but food to satisfy your soul. Because here's what I know about hunger and bread and food. If we are only looking to satiate our hunger, to stop our stomachs from growling, to fill our physical needs, then that is all we are ever going to look for. We become so self-centered that we cannot see the needs and the hunger of others because we are always trying to fill our own bellies to make sure that we have what we need, not just for today, but for tomorrow and next month and maybe even a few years from now. We want our bread, and we want our bread now, like those folks who had been with Jesus. The next day, they wanted bread again. We want it today. We want it tomorrow. We want it for years to come. And when we are so focused on filling our stomachs, we only look out for me and mine. I cannot see beyond myself because I need bread. But Jesus says when we have the bread of life, when we have Jesus, we don't put our blinders on and only focus on ourselves, but the bread of life can satisfy the longings. And the longings aren't always hunger pangs. But there is longing for something more, meaning, purpose, call. When we have the bread of life, we focus not just on our own selves, but we look beyond ourselves because we are satisfied today. Because God has provided today. And so we are satisfied with what we have in order to look beyond ourselves. The Reverend Rob Fuqua, who wrote the book, The God We Can Know, about the I am sayings of Jesus, he says this about this particular saying: when Jesus is my bread of life, I can let go of that need to get all I can for myself and have life my way. I am free to give and share and enjoy. I can say to God, Lord, you've already given me what I need for satisfaction. So I'm going to just enjoy it and look for ways to share it. Because, my friends, when we are satisfied with the bread of life, we are looking not just on our own selves and for our own families, but we are looking out into the world to see where we might be able to bring some manna. In our scripture lesson last week, we heard that God provided the manna from heaven. And as I shared with the people upstairs last week, when God provides manna, sometimes we struggle with that passage because every day for 40 years, the Israelites were given food. They were given quail in the evening and bread in the morning, and God provided for them. But we know in this world today that there are people who are hungry, and so where is the manna for them? But when we have the bread of life, when we are satisfied with the work that God is doing in our lives, when we are provided for every day by God, then we can be the ones who bring the manna from heaven. Because God has placed us in this world to share our bread, to share our blessings. I shared last week with the folks upstairs that I see it happen over and over and over again every day, because I watch you drive to the blessing box and fill it with groceries. And then you drive away, and then not long after, someone drives up and gets some groceries, some daily bread, some manna from heaven. And in that moment, they too are given a piece of the bread of life. Because it is not just food to satisfy their stomachs, but it is hope that they will not always be hungry. It is the belief that someone has put food in that box, not out of obligation, but out of love. Do you know all that was wrapped up in green beans and canned chicken? It is. And over and over and over again, I watch the people of this church fill that box, and others come and take their daily bread. But if we are only focused on our own hunger, we cannot see those who are hungry around us. We cannot see those who are physically hungry, but also spiritually hungry. But Jesus says, I am the bread of life. I am all you need. We do need God's bread every day. I think that's why God sent manna from heaven, bread from heaven, to provide just a little bit of that taste of bread. And we need bread daily. Whether you do carbs or not, you know what I'm talking about. We need food, right? But we also need the bread of life, Jesus Christ, who comes into our lives and shows us that this is not who we are called to be, but we are called to be those who look around, who see, arms open wide, to share manna from heaven, to share the bread of life, who is the life of the world. And so our goal as followers of Jesus Christ are not just to be people who are full, who look for our own bellies to be filled, but people who can be satisfied with what we have today, with what our daily bread is today, so that we can share manna from heaven, that we can look beyond ourselves to offer love and grace and hope and bread and green beans to the world. Let us pray.